in terms of the challenges that journalists face, regardless of whether we are online or we are in the traditional media, I mean, I think the constant challenge is about this question that I think Insani has raised about, you know, if you write something that it could be factual, if you write it and you say that, an Indian group attacked a Malay group in a community somewhere, if you write it in that way and it flares up, are you then responsible for that flaring up happening? Are you then responsible for being provocative? And I think it's a word that came up during Insani's presentation as well. So I think that's a real challenge. And yes, there is, you can call it censorship or sensitivity, as Prangtip has reframed it, within the newsroom, especially in the context of Malaysia, where race is such a huge, big deal. Increasingly, there is that kind of challenge in the newsroom. But I think the larger challenge really is, and Prangtip has touched on it, is how do we go about being, number one, reflective, and number two, having in place certain guidelines that make our reporting ethical and that will make our reporting responsible in the public's interest. Yeah, and I think that's lacking in both the traditional and the online media in Malaysia. Questions like, is it relevant? Is it relevant to name, for example, the racial identity or the religious identity of a particular party in conflict? It's the same question we would ask ourselves when we talk about gender sensitivity. Is it relevant that she is a single woman who was caught, you know, who was murdered in a red light district? Is it relevant that, you know, is it relevant what she was, for example? You know, is it relevant that she was a mother? You know, those kinds of things. So, you know, I think in the same way that we would treat gender-sensitive reporting, we need to start thinking about that kind of sensitivity as well when we're reporting. And it's not about censorship, really. It really is about how do we report responsibly, but I would always add that caveat, in the public's interest, not in the politician's interest, not in the government's interest, but clearly in the public's interest. And your final question about how do we try and address this? Well, at the Nutgraph, we put in very clear, we had very clear house style. I mean, we tried not to report based on race, as in, like, we don't say, oh, Chinese, Malay, Indian kind of thing. But we found that it was really difficult to do that because, for example, when we cover elections, whether we like it or not, the official data about voter breakdown is racialized. You can't run away from it. And it's really hard not to report using that kind of framework because everything else is set up in that way, from political parties right down to, you know, your data about citizens in this country. So what we then decided to do is that we decided that a way around it, to kind of de-racialize it and to remind people that we were actually first and foremost Malaysians and that the whole category of race is arbitrary, it's colonial, and it's used very successfully. It was used very successfully by the British, and now continues to be used very effectively by the Barisan Nasional to divide and rule. So our way of getting around that, which, you know, I think is rather creative, was to just say, to add the word Malaysian at the back of Malay, Indian, and Chinese. So whenever you read the Nutgraph, you will see that it's not just Malay this or Chinese that. How do Malay voters vote compared to Chinese voters? We actually say, how do Malay Malaysians vote compared to Chinese Malaysian voters?